Hi everyone. So my name's James Smith, and I am the lead convener of the Coastal Connections IHR Partnership Seminar Series, along with many of my colleagues in the Coastal Studies Network, including Joanna, who is going to be the chair of this Colonial Coasts session. Basically, the partnership seminars came out of COVID largely, in that they were a chance to sort of make new links and new forums within the Institute for Historical Research at the University of London, which has a very long tradition of in-person seminars. And then basically they got a series of different series together. If you look at the link that I've shared below for the Coastal Connection series, you'll see that we've had several successful webinars already. We're having some more before the end of the year, including this one, and a couple more before the holiday season, which I'll keep everyone apprised of. And also there are other sort of sister series that you can look at on the website. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Joanna to kick us off and introduce our speakers, and we'll take it from there.
Hello all, it's great to be here again and to have so many people watching this session. In this webinar about colonial coasts, we will have 4 researchers from the same team working at 2 Portuguese universities, and they are from the history of science and technology. We could have called this session Engineer Coasts, because they are going to talk about their work on the infrastructures built on the coasts of the Portuguese African Empire to control and explore those territories in the 19th century. It's interesting because none of them studies the coasts in particular, but coasts are part of their research. And I would say this is a good example of how coastal issues can be present in many subfields of history, sometimes indirectly, sometimes overlooked, but they allow to establish connections between different approaches, interests, geographies, and time scales. I don't know if they are going to present in this order, but I'm going to present our speakers. I think they will talk mainly as a team. Maria Paula Diogo, you can see their names, is full professor of history of science, of history of technology at Nova School of Sciences and Technology. And she was a pioneer in Portugal in the field of history of technology. And her research focused on technology and engineering in Portugal and the colonies. She's working on globalization, circulation, appropriation of science and technology, networks, and more recently on the Anthropocene. Then we'll have Ana Simões. Ana Simões is also full professor of history of science at the Faculty of Sciences in the University of Lisbon, which is mine. And she's a member of the Center for the History of Science and Technology. She's also the vice president of the European Society for the History of Science, after being its president for 2 years. She is also member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science. And her research includes the history of quantum chemistry and the history of science in Portugal. It's interesting because Anna is from physics, but then she started working in the history of science. Mm-hmm. And then we will have Maria Luísa Sousa is an historian of technology and researcher at the history of the Center for the History of Science and Technology, and she's a professor at the Department of Applied Social Sciences. And she focuses on social technical systems of automobiles, and she's working in a project about Lisbon and cyclable. How can we say cyclable? Cycling mobilities in Lisbon. And then we'll have Hugo. Hugo Pereira is also an historian of technology and a researcher at the Center for History of Science and Technology. He was a visiting fellow at the University of York and also at the MIT. He's working on a project about production, publication, and circulation of photography and science, technology, and engineering artifacts in Portugal and the colonial context. So please, the floor is yours. You can start.
Thank you. So I will just share a very short PowerPoint. Yeah. So let me just.
Yeah, you should try to just concentrate on one slide.
Yeah, I'm just trying to go for the same. So this is a general one, so I just skip to the first one. So good afternoon to all, and thank you, Joanna and the Coastal Network for the invitation. Let me just add some data on our presentation. As Joanna already presented as a group, we are all historians of technology and historians of science from the Center for the History of Science and Technology in Lisbon, which is a research unit that, as Joanna just mentioned, is associated with two universities in Lisbon, the University of Lisbon and the Nova University of Lisbon. So I will very briefly introduce our take on the meaning of coasts, and then Hugo, Luísa, and Ana will focus also briefly on specific examples from the Portuguese case, both colonial and concerning Lisbon as the center of the empire, very briefly in order to keep our 20 minutes under control and allow us plenty of time for discussion. So being an historian of technology, when Joanna mentioned these seminars on coasts, I immediately thought of harbours. For us, historians of science and technology, the concept of coast pairs with the concept of hinterland, and both are part of a wider economic and political context. In this sense, the harbours embodies, and I would dare to say that the harbour cannibalizes the coast and asserts itself as one of the nodes of a system of large technological systems that aims at domesticating and hierarchize the territory, and that relies on subsystems such as mobility, sanitation, water distribution, or electricity. Harbours are in fact a critical piece in circulation of flows, be them people, money, or goods, and they play simultaneously the role of gateways and gatekeepers, or using a very trendy concept from global history, they are portals of globalization. We have been exploring this double identity of gateways and gatekeepers, mostly within the Portuguese colonial context. As you probably know, Portugal had a long-lasting African empire, which finally came to its end in 1974, so quite recently, as a result of the fall of the authoritarian regime that ruled Portugal for around 50 years. The map that you see in the slide is a well-known image from the dictatorship propaganda, in which Portugal is shown as a big country because it includes both its European and African territories. So when compared with Europe itself, it is in fact a very huge country. The image is particularly interesting for us, not only from the perspective of the iconography of the dictatorship, which is of course quite interesting, but because it unveils the tensions between a country, which is a periphery European-wise, and seeks recognition within the European arena, but that is at the same time a center when it comes to its empire. So as the harbor, it plays a double role, as a periphery and as a center. So the way we are interested in exploring the concept of portals of globalization, in which the harbor is a keystone, in fact, is by using the lens of the center-periphery framework. That is, to use center and peripheries as actor categories, thus calling for its historicization. Both centers and peripheries, in our perspective and in our framework, are not at all moral categories, one being good and the other bad. They are not fixed in time and space, so a center may become a periphery and a periphery may become a center, and Portugal is a perfect example of this changing status, but they do have different agencies and perform different instances of power. And it is this that we want to explore. More recently, and within our interest in the concept of Anthropocene, we have been exploring a quite unconventional connection between precisely these large technological systems and the concept of the large technological system. It's a kind of bread and butter for historians of technology. We use it a lot, and it is one of the main concepts and tools for exploring our objects of study. So between technological systems and nature, precisely by proposing to analyze how the role played by harbors, railways, and cities in colonial contexts as tools to discipline the territory may contribute to transform nature itself in a large technological system. We argue that the so-called portals of globalization, and we prefer to name it, and we did it, anthropogenic hotspots, are the building blocks of the Anthropocene, as they sum up the planetary changes that characterize the Anthropocene, namely environmental crises and climate wars, depletion of natural resources, and inequality of global income, as well as political agency. These anthropogenic hotspots encapsulate site-specific anthropogenic landscapes, and they double as local and global scales, and thus epitomize the entanglements of the Anthropocene. And in fact, this global and local scale is also embodied by the harbor, and in the same way by the coast itself. This is something that we are still discussing and designing as a research project. We know, of course, that nature is very different from a canonical large technological system, typically railways, roads, electricity. But we believe that by using this unconventional and innovative approach to the concept of nature, it will be possible to bring to the forefront new interconnections among actors, both human and non-human, engaged in co-evolutionary processes that entail multiple and interdependent dynamics in a seamless web. We follow the most recent trends concerning the possibility to push the borders of the concept of infrastructure in order to include heterogeneous infrastructures, which are also known as second-order infrastructures, such as trade, industrial, financial, or knowledge infrastructures. So combining elements of many other infrastructure systems to facilitate long-distance flows of resources, products, capital, knowledge, and so on. And of course, and coming back to the beginning of my brief introduction, harbors and coasts, that in our research are almost synonyms, are at the core of this circulation matrix. Now we will take some examples based in our research. Hugo will approach the deep relationship between railways and harbors in Portuguese African colonies, bringing together the hinterland and the coastal liaisons. Luísa will continue to explore these mobility connections, but based on cars. And Anna will focus on Lisbon, as I mentioned before, the center of the empire, and particularly on its harbor, crisscrossing history of science, technology, and urban history. So I will now give the floor to Hugo. Just let me change the.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you for the invitation for this conference. I'm very happy to be here. Considering that time is short, I'm going to start my presentation immediately. As Maria Paula said, railways and harbours were crucial, were key, were central to the Portuguese colonial project. Even though there was in the early decades, starting in the 1880s, there was a clear preference for railways, as they were much efficient tools for the territorial appropriation, to use the term of Matthias Carholm, of the colonial landscape. Furthermore, railways were the icon of progress, the icon of the technological sublime, and therefore they were much more efficient in showing that Portugal was appropriating the colonial landscape, the colonial territories, which was a criticism that most European powers were doing of Portugal at the time. In these two maps, you can see the state of the Portuguese network, colonial railways network, more or less in the 1920s. And you can see that all of the railways, they start in the coast and they go and they follow towards the hinterland. In the following decades, until the 1930s, 1940s, some of these lines grew a little farther, but you can see here more or less how the network was in its more or less full extension. My focus on this binomial between ports and railways is through the concept of portals of globalization, which are those places that serve as entrance points for cultural, commercial, social, and political global connectednesses and relationships. And both these two infrastructures, they incorporate well this notion, and this notion fits well these two infrastructures. First of all, because they both incorporate the globalized idea of progress that characterized the 19th century, the late 19th century and early 20th century. Additionally, they were a key factor for Portugal to be included in global financial flows, as most of the finance to build these railways and these ports, it came from abroad, mostly from Britain. When they start during construction, the work yards, they became a portal of globalization and a globalized stage, considering that they attracted experts from all over Europe. Of course, Portuguese engineers played a very important role, but they weren't enough to meet the demands, and therefore other engineers from Britain, from France, from Belgium, and from other countries, even from the United States and even from New Zealand, they arrived to these work yards to work side by side with the Portuguese engineers. And of course, they were also engaged with the natives, the local populations that were forcibly included in this globalizing process. When construction began, when operation began, ports and the railways, they were very important to include colonial and metropolitan merchandise in global flows. Many products manufactured in the mainland, they traveled through the sea to the ports, and then they traveled to the hinterland to help settlers to settle in the colonial landscape. On the opposite direction, colonial products like coffee or rubber, they were, and in Mozambique, gold and diamonds, they were transported back to the harbors, where they were shipped to the mainland and to other ports abroad. However, this is also a concept that I am analyzing in my research. These globalizing flows, they clashed with the development of the nation state, which occurs more or less in the starting in the 19th century. Despite the globalizing rhetoric that accompanied most of this project, the fact is that Portuguese stakeholders, they wanted to use ports and mostly railways to build up the Portuguese presence in the colonies, and to, so to say, nationalize the colonies and shun away the presence of foreign agents. On the other hand, the colonies that bordered the Portuguese overseas domains, they also struggled to make it difficult for making trans-border connections, as they also had their own harbors, their own ports, and they wanted to feed those harbors and those railways with their own traffic. Well, in any way, throughout the late 19th and the middle of the 19th century, these commercial flows and these economic flows, and even this exchange of cultural backgrounds, they grew throughout the decades, and the number of settlers in the Portuguese colonies grew. The commerce between Portugal and its colonies, the transportation of colonial commodities also grew, and this contributed to support the Portuguese colonial project in the late 19th and also in the 20th century. And very briefly, this is what I have to say about colonial railways and harbors and their connections to the coast. And so I give the floor to Luísa, right?
Yes, please, Luísa.
Well, now I'm going to move a little bit in time and talk about road research in the post-World War II period. And precisely it had to do with reaching places that were not served by railways, including coastal zones. As you could see in the maps that Hugo showed, many places in the coastal zones did not have any connection. What was in stake was the adaptation of roads or paths that were only for the purpose of modes of mobility in use by foot, like at porterage or barrel rolling, and to adapt and construct new roads for motor vehicles and especially trucks. This was a concern by European colonizers in Africa, and this forged a quest for a scientific approach on road planning and construction, which was already in place in Europe since the beginning of the 20th century. And in Portuguese Africa, this question started to be discussed in the 1930s. And there was a great institutional investment by the creation of national road bureaus and civil engineering laboratories, including later also in Angola and Mozambique. And also this was discussed at transnational expert arenas, particularly engineers, namely at the Permanent International Association of Road Congresses. This was a European-based association created in Paris in 1909. And particularly the issue on thinly populated or undeveloped countries was discussed at the Lisbon Congress in 1951. And it led to the creation in 1953 to the low-cost roads technical subcommittee, of which Portugal was part of. And also Portuguese engineers used this subcommittee to promote their colonial expertise, and in one way, and in the other to legitimate the colonial power of the Portuguese state. The other arena was the International Road Federation, which was a lobby for motorized traffic based in the US, created in 1948, and it defended a different approach. Instead of low-cost roads, YPR, it defends roads for high capacity crossing different African territories. There were also other players. Thank you. There were also other players that were discussing this research, namely the Scientific Council for Africa South of the Sahara and UNESCO. And you see here some books that were published as results of this research. And here I must say that there were tensions on agencies that were more favoring the new nations after independence in Africa. And also there were, for instance, the Scientific Council for Africa South of Sahara until the independence of Ghana in the late 50s was a place for changing colonial knowledge between different colonial empires. But after the independence of Ghana, it became Africanized. And so it started defending, and also Portugal was expelled from this. Next slide, please. And so one thing, Portugal was the colonial empire which took longer to decolonize. And one of the tools that it used to make the empire last was the development plans. Then this you have here the distribution of the budget for the so-called overseas in the first, the second, the intercalar, I don't know how to translate this, and then the third development plan. And in the blue arrow, you see the investment made in transport and communication. So development was still based a lot on public works and particularly transport and communications. And then regarding roads, what you see is that from the 60s onwards, paralleling the beginning of the colonial independence wars in Angola and Mozambique, you see that there was a huge investment in infrastructures and particularly roads. And roads were part of the war effort and were also used by the guerrilla war. They were a tool of control. And then to conclude this part, this is the case I'm making here is that technologies, this is not an original thesis, but technology and science had a role in the reinforcement of Portuguese colonial rule in the post-World War II period. Well, it has been said already that the right-wing dictatorship, Estado Novo, that lasted until 1974, used this technological expertise and experts to legitimize its colonial occupation. This is not only done by the new state. Of course, this was done since the 19th century, as Hugo mentioned, with the railways. The promotion of this fomento, these development policies, included public works, and technology played a role as a kind of second colonial occupation. And again, this is not the specificity of the Portuguese Empire. It also happened in the French and the British colonial empires. So they said to do more with the development to the hinterland. Thank you.
Okay, so now it's my turn, and I ask you to move from the Portuguese colonies to Lisbon in Europe, and also to travel back in time from the 20th century to the second half of the 19th century, and again to look at urban history of science, technology, and medicine as an interconnected network in which ports act, as Paula said, as gateways. In this case, Lisbon acted as a gateway to Europe, but on the other hand, also as a gatekeeper. And I will be concentrating on the problem of health control, disease control, and prevention of contagion coming mostly by sea. So Lisbon was a port city and imperial metropolis. Together with its river Tagus, which you can see in this picture, it was a gateway to the Atlantic and to Europe. and it acted not only as a large space for the circulation of people and goods, but also for control, both in terms of commercial activity and sanitary conditions. Since the 16th century, the maritime protection of Lisbon was dependent on a building. Just put the other one, Paula, sorry, because this is not the new, okay. So, since the 16th century, the protection of Lisbon was dependent of a building, which is mentioned as the Lazaretto there, located on the other side of the river Tagus. But by mid-19th century, this was in very bad conditions. And so the Portuguese authorities at the time decided to construct a new building close to the original fortress that housed the old Lazaretto. The first plans of this new Lazaretto began in 1858, but the installation with the complex of buildings was finished by 1869. The construction coincided, and this is something really interesting to discuss, with a moment of change in disease containment strategies. And we went through this sort of discussions very recently, having in mind the COVID-19 pandemic. Alternative medical theories on contagion were debated both nationally and internationally. There were two competing alternative medical theories: the so-called germ theory, which considered that contagion was not mediated by humans, but by a microorganism, which would very soon be identified by experimental medicine. And the opponents to germ theory were advocates of what they called the miasmatic theory, which considered that it was the unhealthy properties of air and vapors, emanations, that were responsible for the propagation of diseases. So, although both competing theories defended the reinforcement of hygiene as a fundamental measure for disease prevention, they did not agree on the need for confinement. Physicians defending the germ theory supported confinement, while specialists who shared the miasmatic theory did not consider physical restraint as fundamental. These different positions concerning medicine and health control were not, of course, the only ones to justify different sanitary options, which really were often heavily dependent on the geographical location of the various cities. For example, in the case of Lisbon, due to its central position between Europe, America, and Africa, and also due to this the permeability of its port with this large estuary, Lisbon took really very seriously the fight against diseases coming from sea, and for long defended confinement, not only to secure the health of the Portuguese population, but also to save the country's trade-based economy. So, after all, cholera had hit Lisbon. Okay, you can go on. Yeah, this is the new Lazaretto. So this is the main building of the new Lazaretto with its 7 wings. Still survives in this condition. This is the building we were talking about, which was constructed in the second half of the 19th century, precisely when discussions concerning the pros and cons of confinement were really hitting most medical experts and the politicians around Europe. So why did Lisbon stick for so much, for so long in this idea of confinement? Because Lisbon had been hit severely by cholera in 1855, precisely via an English ship which, based on diplomatic arguments, had escaped the mandatory quarantine. And 2 years later, in 57, yellow fever hit the capital again, after cargo and corpses aboard the ship coming from Brazil stayed in customs without disinfection, triggering an outbreak of yellow fever among customs workers, which of course propagated immediately to the population. So, therefore, the debate concerning this new Lazaretto was always associated with the port of Lisbon and involved various experts, as well as hygiene, public health issues, economy, and political points. However, as the port of Lisbon began to be renovated with the modernization of its quays and improvement of land transport by means of roads and railways to facilitate maritime traffic, the obligation to maintain the quarantine at Lazaretto was called into question. You can move to the other slide, Paula. Thank you. The need to find a new balance between the retention of goods and people for health purposes and the desired expansion of international trade pointed to other solutions. At the end of the 19th century, after a period of progressive reduction of quarantines, and this happened all over Europe, Portuguese authorities decided to completely rethink the organization of the Portuguese health system. At the beginning of the 20th century, a physician, a very well-known Portuguese physician responsible for the sanitary measures imposed during the outbreak of plague, which had hit Porto 2 years earlier, presented a new general regulation of the health system. This new system was based on several measures, which organized in a very flexible way the circulation between sea and land, creating various nodes, not just one spot, Lazaretto, uniting the network of the new health system. So, mandatory quarantine in Lazaretto was substituted by reduction of quarantine in specific instances, but mostly by disinfection and fumigation of goods on board and ashore. Thus, while goods were handled in the facilities of the disinfection station created in Port of Lisbon, and what you see in this picture is precisely the building of the disinfection station, travelers waited on board for the visit of the physician. After inspecting the ship and gathering information from the captain, the physician decided if there was any quarantine to be enforced or if crew and passengers were free to circulate in the country after disinfection. So, this new system of health control was based on decentralization of inspection sites, and this is really a crucial change. But on the other hand, it moved the protection against epidemics from outside the city into the city. It really became an urban question. In international terms, these new practices were also integrated in European legislation that aimed to build an international health network going far beyond national and European borders. So, to conclude, Lisbon, due to its strategic position between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, Europe and America, and due to its imperial dimensions, its various colonies in Africa and also in Asia, played a relevant role in the new international health system of surveillance and control of maritime borders. So, thank you.
Maria Paula, can you start? Can you stop?
I will start. So thank you. As you can see from these examples, and as Joanna mentioned in the beginning, this could be easily a talk on engineering coasts, because in fact, for historians of science and technology, coasts are mainly places where science and technology have their share in transforming it. So in this sense, I think that what Joanna just mentioned in the beginning is particularly interesting, because in fact, different disciplines look at the same object from different ways. And of course, we have a lot to gain if we are able to bring together different perspectives on this historical object. So thank you, and please go ahead with your questions.
Stop share, yeah, okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was quite interesting. I took a lot of notes. And before starting our discussion, I would say that because we are not too many, if you want to do any question, please write it on the chat, or you can just turn on your camera and microphone and do it. I would also like to say before the discussion that while I was reading or listening to your presentations, I thought that we can say that there are two kinds of movements in the coasts. We can think that is, we consider them as gates, we can think about in and out.
Mm-hmm.
Harbors have this function, the things that come in and the things that come out from different places. It could be merchandising, animal, people, ideas, and diseases. But also, if you think about developments, and I was thinking about Anna's last picture about the harbor and coasts as Anthropocene hotspots.
Mm-hmm.
In the 20th century, we can see that there was a change. The coasts are not just for in and out circulation, but also a lot of movements along the coast.
Mm-hmm.
As coastal harbors were developed, as cities were developed along the coasts. And so I think we can have here different ideas about what the coasts are today. But then I think we can start our discussion and allow other people to participate and say whatever they want about colonial or engineered coasts.
Maybe let me just say something maybe for giving the floor to the audience. When we approach any document on colonial coasts, Angola, Mozambique, and so on, we always have the problem of population and the question of precisely how colonization of Angola and Mozambique should be promoted in order to allow people to go from the coast to the hinterland. And this was a main question during the 19th century because precisely of the new imperialism. So if we don't have people in the hinterland, the colony may not be considered as Portuguese, for instance. And this completely changed the perception on the relevance of coasts and the hinterland. And in fact, it engineered the whole continent. And that's why both the railways, which are very normative, they are very efficient, as Hugo mentioned, but they are as well very normative, but also roads, as Luísa said, they allow us for a flexibility of controlling the territory completely different. And in fact, this changed not only the colonies themselves, but also the way the metropoles, in the case of Lisbon, had to think about precisely the flows of people coming and going from Europe to the colonies. So that's something that is recurrent and which is quite interesting to be aware of it when thinking about the coasts and the hinterland. So
we have two questions on the chat. One is for Anna. Anna, I think it's better if you read it, and then the others can also see the other questions. I think it's better if.
Okay, so let me read first one. Isaac Land enjoyed the good or global or comparative history of quarantine. Okay, I'm an urban historian of science who recently have been editing a book on urban history of Lisbon. And in fact, in this edited volume, many of us participated in this book, like Paula and Luísa. And in this book, we have two chapters on, health issues, which move from this containment to the prevention along a decentralized or multi-nodal network. And so we were involved, yes, with some people who have been working on quarantines specifically. So this is a long way to say that I'm not a specialist on quarantines. So I'm not sure I know how to answer definitely to the Isaac's comment, but what I know is that there has been recently published a book called Mediterranean Quarantines, which tries to make a comparison between different ways of looking at prevention mechanisms, looking precisely on different cities around the Mediterranean. And I also know that there is a group called precisely Quarantine Studies, which I can connect you with, and which probably can answer you on this question. They have also been organizing very regularly workshops on a yearly base at least, and I'm not sure if they have also, as you have, these reading groups and regular discussion group, but they are very active. And what I know also is that they want to do, in a sense, going to a more global approach to quarantines by not really looking at the major cases and looking at the very different sorts of cases. So this is the first question.
The other ones, maybe I can give some ideas, and then Luísa can edit based on their work. Concerning the first one, actually, most of the questions concerning the choice of areas where to build the infrastructures had a lot to do with questions concerning health. For someone that would go from Europe to Africa to build a railway or to build an harbor, one of the main problems was precisely how to keep these people healthy. Mm-hmm. So there were certain areas of the African territories, not only the hinterland, which is more common, but also coastal areas, which were extremely difficult for Europeans to live in. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, there were a kind of areas in which there were no infrastructures, and there was no investment as well. On the other hand, the building of the infrastructures were often also very strongly influenced by lobbying groups. So in fact, the question of agriculture in Africa and the extraction of minerals is critical to understand the choices from the choices made, for instance, concerning the railways. Often we think about the choices as a technical or based on expertise, but lots of times the choices that were made to build a railway were not the best engineering choices. Mm-hmm. They were in fact influenced either by economic issues, by health issues, or globally by relationships between empires. Because in fact, when we look to the empire, that has to do with the second question by Sebastian, we cannot look at them as the Portuguese Empire. Yes, there was the Portuguese Empire, but lots of the solutions and lots of the choices made by the Portuguese Empire had to do with the relationship between the Portuguese Empire and, for instance, the British Empire, or the Boers, or the German interest in certain areas. So we have to look at it as a kind of integrated, I would say, large technological system in a way, because in fact it joined everything together. And for instance, the idea, some of the harbors in Mozambique and Angola were decided because of the harbors that existed in the British Empire. So in fact, the question both James and Sebastian put in the chat are very interesting, because in fact there is this idea of the imperial frontiers, not just ones that come from the coast and the territory, the sea territory in front of the coast, but between the relationship of hegemony built by the different harbors in different empires. So I would say that, yeah, but maybe Hugo and Luísa can add on this. What do you think?
Yeah, Hugo
Hugo
wants to say something, I think.
I just go ahead and add something on the sacrifice
Yes,
zone.
can you hear me?
No? Vais tu?
Go ahead, Luísa.
Okay. A very well-known case is studied, for instance, by Alan Isaacman on the Cahora Bassa Dam in Mozambique, and maybe you can call that a sacrifice zone. It had huge environmental costs and the moving of populations. And also in the context of the colonial war or the colonial wars, people were displaced as well. I'm not sure if you can to do strategic settlements. I'm not sure if you can include this here because it is a context of the war, but still it has to do with profound changes for the people who live there. But actually the dam, the Cahora Bassa Dam is the biggest example of this, as far as I remember.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I may add a thought or two. The idea of sacrifice zones of areas that were under a constant environmental change. There were a few, and that also accounted for the lack of investment in those areas for many decades. Either they were, for instance, in the south of Mozambique, there were areas that were where the sleeping sickness was very fierce, and it was very difficult to build something there. It was very difficult to traverse those regions, and that also accounted for the construction of infrastructures like railways. It was a way to overcome that difficulty. Another good example, it happened in the north of Mozambique, in the valley of the Zambezi. In the late 19th century, the water volume of the valley began to decrease, and it led to the settlers in Malawi, where Nyasaland back then, were struggling to find a way to reach the shore. And that also led to the construction of a new harbor connecting the Portuguese harbor of Beira to the British protectorate of Nyasaland. The Beira itself was also a very, could also be considered a sacrifice zone, if I understand the concept correctly, as it was a place where the tides and the river basin, the river Pungue, was constantly changing. And it was a cause for the lack of investment for many decades. But then through investment in technology, in the harbor, in the railway, that area became more controlled from an environmental point of view. And it allowed for the settling of Portuguese families and populations. And the city, Beira, grew. It was previously it was a swamp, basically. But it throughout as time went by, it grew as a city and around the harbor.
We have another question that maybe also we can add something. In fact, as it depends on the moment you are thinking about, but during the 19th century, it is largely, in a way, the other way around. That is, the railways, and that's why we mentioned that there were very strong lobbies concerning the design of the railways, for instance, had to do precisely with this idea that all areas that would have a railway line would be very interesting from the economic perspective. Those who were outside those lines would of course be less interesting. So there were these economic interests were built largely around precisely the railways. So they were not chosen because there were already lines of communication, travel, and over there they were precisely imposing a kind of different perspective. For instance, I remember that once I went to a short meeting, and there was a colleague from Africa who was studying precisely the changes in traveling with the cows and the other animals along areas in which the railways were built, and the changes that local indigenous populations had to force, because it's not the area that was before a kind of homogeneous territory became a fragmented territory. So I would say that during the 19th century, the new imperialism, most of the infrastructures were built from scratch in order to implement a kind of new rationality that was, of course, built on economic and political interests. So I'm not sure if I answered to your question, Sebastian, but maybe Luísa, Anna, or Hugo want to add something on this?
Yeah, I may add that, well, until the late 19th century, the Portuguese presence was mostly in the coast.
Yeah.
And there weren't any strong connections with the hinterland. This is an idea that's very difficult to transmit in Portuguese society, because we have the idea of 500 years, and it was for many centuries mostly some settlements in the coast.
Exactly.
But then again, the knowledge about the African hinterland by the Portuguese experts was also very scarce. It was very limited, and I think that cartography took more advantage of the railway construction than the other way around. And another thing that's important to add to the decision-making process regarding the definition of the routes is the leasing contract itself. Some of the contracts to build railways in Angola and Mozambique, they had a guarantee of yield. So so the company profited more if the railway was longer. So the route was also affected by those financial and economic interests. But to answer your question, no, it was like Maria Paula said, the railway routes did not follow any previous economic routes.
Just to add to the sacrifice zones, maybe there's also a very interesting study on the ways to control precisely the sleeping disease, which was done both in Portuguese colonies, but mostly in British ones, which was precisely to burn the trees and the vegetation, because that would eliminate the vector as well. So this would, of course, introduce a very strong imbalances in the territory as well, because okay, the mosquito goes away, but also lots of things go away at the same time. So this also introduces a kind of imbalance, which is interesting to be taken in context. And the same happened with the construction of some railway lines as well. Yeah.
Just to add something, another detail, the routes were also influenced by some emerging economic interests that appeared during or shortly afterwards, after construction. For instance, in the south of Mozambique, the railway that connected the Lourenço Marques, nowadays Maputo, to the Transvaal in South Africa, was motivated by the discovery of iron and gold ore in the mines of South Africa. In Angola, another example, for instance, is the Moçambique railway in the south. It was built in order to take Portuguese troops to fight some native countries, some native tribes in the south of Mozambique, in the south of Angola. Sorry. Of course, that the railway, when it arrived to those areas, the rebellion was long gone and the war was long over. But in any case, it was motivated by those that emerging interest that appeared shortly afterwards, after the construction began.
Mm-hmm.
Well, just to be part of the discussion, I was thinking that in the case of Beira, the city of Beira, for instance, in Mozambique, the old city developed because of the harbor and the railway. There was nothing there before that. And basically, the city developed because of the Portuguese that went there to build the ports and the railway, and then all the labor that developed. And I remember that in some plans for the urbanization of Beira, there was different areas. I think we have a lot of noise. If some of you can turn off your mic. In some urbanization plans, it's interesting to note that the city was developed according to different races, different people, the laborers and the European, and also according to the health areas and the ones that were more prone to diseases. So the labor were put in areas that were more, or would say bad areas, while the European were habiting near the coast, which was considered healthier.
Yeah,
that part is also interesting.
Yeah, we maybe you I can send you or Joanna as certainly as the reference on that book that we edited on gardens and the Anthropocene. There's a chapter precisely by Anna Roque on these questions of building the city, and so maybe it would be interesting for you as well to go a little bit further on this direction that Joanna just mentioned, the different layers of the city concerning the different population groups, the different status, and so forth, which is very interesting. The neighborhoods, the building of the neighborhoods, and where is considered the end of the city, which is very interesting as well. This idea of the border is always something very interesting for historians, and particularly for historians of science and technology, but I believe for you as well, this idea, where do we establish the border of this kind of gray zones between the city and the outside of the city, between the coast and the hinterland. So these are very interesting dichotomies which are there to be explored, hopefully by us all. So yeah.
I can add one thing concerning all this, which is a concept in which we also thought helpful in addressing these topics, which is the idea of socio-technical imaginaries, which is also very clear both in what we have been discussing concerning infrastructures in the Portuguese colonies or in the development of the city of Lisbon. I mean, due to several restrictions, financial, political, otherwise, there is always this tension concerning, I mean, huge urban reconstruction, infrastructures, bridges tying one side of Tagus to the other, or a railway connecting the coast of Angola to the coast of Mozambique. And then, of course, the clashes between these visions, these grandiose visions, and not only the internal conditions of the country, but also conditions tying the country and the ambitions of the country with other empires. And this is very clear in the Portuguese case and quite helpful to deal with all these different dimensions of coastal connections in a way.
have another message?
Thank you.
Oh, okay.
We thank you for the invitation and for the great questions. We could be here for the whole afternoon. I was thinking about also the concept of invisibilities, which would very much suit this discussion we have been having here. So hopefully for another seminar on what remained outside this seminar. So we thank you all.
Well, but we will still have a little more time, and I would like to ask you, if we consider, I was recently at a conference about infrastructures, and we were discussing the idea of nature and basically coasts, beach, and dunes as infrastructures. But I was interested to know your opinion, and if we think about the anthropogenic hotspots, can we consider that colonial coasts were the major anthropogenic hotspots in Africa?
Yeah.
Yeah. At least in the Portuguese case, right?
Our project, we have been, all of us have been working on this project, and precisely what we propose, we didn't manage until now to have the funding, but what we have proposed exactly was to study specific anthropogenic hotspots. In the case of the colonial Portuguese empire, that would be precisely railways, cities, and harbours.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be what we wanted, our main objects. And we chose Luanda and Mozambique for the first approach. So they would be a kind of test beds for the concept. Yeah, it would be a privileged area to study and to apply this concept. And also to try to figure out if this idea of having nature as a kind of second order infrastructure, and thus being able to analyze it as a large technological system would in fact unveil different kind of layers in the traditional studies on infrastructure, infrastructuring the colonial empires. So hopefully we will have our project funded, and we will be able to try the hypothesis. But yes, costs would be one of our first.
I think that is very interesting, because we can use coasts as a base to study so many different layers. And also the idea of this presentation, it doesn't have to be the center. We are not all coastal historians, but there is so many things that we can study about coast in society, economy, science and technology. Then I think it's exactly anthropogenic hotspot. And it would be, and it's quite interesting if we can think about coasts and have different people from different areas analyzing coasts from this perspective.
Hopefully, yes.
So I would like to ask if there is other questions. If someone in the audience want to share something about their own experience and work on the coasts connected to colonial coasts or coastal histories.
Can I ask a question to someone in the audience? An open question. How do you deal with in coastal studies with the hinterland? How do you deal with the hinterland generally? Do you study it at all or not?
That would be probably the subject for another webinar. the answer to the hinterland question, as we asked ourselves immediately for the hinterland, maybe we could have a seminar, a webinar on the hinterland and coast, and discuss it from the perspective of historians of technology and the coastal historians. Or
well, there is a classic essay. This is quite old, but by Michael Pearson, the Australian historian of the Indian Ocean. And he has this lovely discussion. This is way back from 1984. But he says that the coast, where does the coast begin? Where does it end? He really says that the coast ends where its influence ends. And so what he's talking about is the coast of India. But he argues because the events on the coast are shaping markets inland, he says the coast of South Asia extends as far inland as Kandahar in present-day Afghanistan. And so I think that is definitely the serious engagement with the hinterland that you were suggesting there.
Mm-hmm.
You can maybe type in the citation of that. It's not a very well-known essay.
It would be nice, yeah.
So we can think about ports and railways as extending the influence of the coast.
Yeah.
Because the railways are coming from the coast and to the hinterlands, and so we can think that they take and extend the influence of the coast in areas where it didn't arrive before, but also rivers can act like that. And navigation was mainly the first connection between coasts and hinterland.
Mm-hmm.
There's another question on the chat by James. I don't know if any of you want to address it.
Just to say that there is ongoing research on this, namely by anthropologists in the port of Luanda, for instance, in Angola. But please go.
Yeah.
Well, my take on this is that some of the rhetoric and the ideology that was behind the Portuguese public works program is still living today in Angola and Mozambique as independent countries, because they are still also investing very much in large buildings, large public works that are much more than just buildings. They have a special symbolism of development, of progress, and that can be traced back to the colonial days. Furthermore, nowadays the railways in Angola are being a target for a very strong investment, mostly from China and India, and some of the stations in those rebuilt lines are immense. They are incredibly vast, full with large surfaces of glass. They were built to impress, and some of them are also in the coasts, and the coast also remains as an anthropogenic as it was back in the colonial days.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the I would say successes of the new imperialism, and then the colonialism itself was precisely because it's part of the process itself, is to implement this kind of new worldview in which progress equals public works.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there is any other comments.
There are just, I'm not sure, there are also something that it's relevant, that is questions concerning technical assistance, and also questions concerning the interests of companies which were part of the colonial system, then went off of the colonies, and now are coming back from also. So
we are having some problems. Maybe
Are you listening to me?
Yes.
Okay.
Now we are.
Yeah. So in that case, for instance, they have those huge glass-made railway stations, but nobody can use them because the temperature inside is so high that you should have to use air conditioning in a very strong and mandatory way, and it's not possible where they have been built. So it's completely inadequate, but it shows this different and very strange relationships between the colonial world, the post-colonial world, and the neo-colonial world.
Yeah. Okay.
If there is no more comments, I think we will finish for today.
May I just add something, another detail? I was, when we were talking about centers and peripheries, I was remembering a paper I wrote a few years ago, where I used the concept of semi-periphery. And the coasts, they can be placed in this semi-periphery as they are placed between the center, which is Lisbon, and the periphery, or the ultra-periphery, which is the colonial landscape and the colonial hinterland. So in this sense, the coast may be considered in this fashion as being in between the center of the empire and its periphery, and it gives the coast a very well, a specificity that might be worth looking into.
And the sacrifice zones would be the ultra periphery in that case. So we could rearrange the circles.
Well, I think that is quite interesting because the coast can be the peripheries, and we living in Portugal feel that we are in the periphery, we are the coast of Europe. But at the same time, if we consider has connections to the world, they can also be the center. And for the Portuguese, Lisbon was the center of the empire for such a long time. But it's not only Lisbon, all the coasts can work both ways as peripheries and centers for so many things. So again, we can see it as the Anthropocene spots. So if there isn't any other comments, I would finish our session for today. I would like to thank Maria Paula, Anna, Luísa, and Hugo for participating, and all the others that were here today. This was a very interesting session.